a young college student who was brutally killed on a Prescott hiking trail decades ago, was the victim of a serial predator who took his own life years later, authorities said in August of this year. Yavapai County Sheriff David Rhodes announced at a news conference that DNA evidence indicates Brian Scott Bennett was the man responsible for 23-year-old Cathy Sposito's 1987 death. Early on the morning of June 13, 1987, 23-year-old Cathy Sposito set out on a hike along Thumb Butt Trail in Prescott, Arizona. During the trek, others heard her scream and rushed to her aid, only to find her bloodied and dead on the trail. Sposito's murder quickly went cold, but local police have just announced that a serial sexual predator named Brian Scott Bennett was likely her killer. Police believe that Bennett, who was just 16 at the time, hit Sposito with a rock and a wrench, shot her in the eye, and stabbed her in the head before fleeing the scene. According to reports, Sposito was likely Bennett's first victim, but he went on to attack at least 3 other women. In April 1990, Bennett was accused of sexually assaulting another woman on the same trail, at the same time of day as Sposito, as she was camping with her boyfriend. That same year, he allegedly locked a girl in a room during a house party and tried to sexually assault her. And in June 1993, Bennett allegedly kidnapped another woman from a post office in Prescott, sexually assaulted her, and threatened to kill her because she'd seen his face. Though Bennett was arrested for the house party assault and the kidnapping, he was never convicted of anything due to a lack of evidence. In 1994, he moved home to Kentucky and died by suicide. For decades, both Sposito's murder and the sexual assault on Thumb Butt Trail remained cold cases. According to reports, it took a group of volunteers from Yavapai County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit and DNA technology to finally identify Bennett as the perpetrator. In 2020, the Cold Case Unit started to dig into the unsolved 1990 sexual assault. DNA from that case led them to 2 men, brothers, who had lived in the area at the time. Then, the investigators discovered that one of the brothers, Brian Scott Bennett, was tied to other sexual assaults. To be absolutely certain, investigators had Bennett's body exhumed in November 2022. They found that his DNA matched the 1990 sexual assault, and that his DNA also matched some found on the ratchet wrench used to bludgeon Sposito. That said, investigators also found other people's DNA on the wrench, so they haven't yet officially closed Sposito's case. For Renee Sandoval, the woman Bennett kidnapped in 1993, the discovery brings a sense of closure. Sandoval was rescued when police happened to pull over Bennett's car, but she never got to see him convicted for his crime. She thanked the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office for giving credence to her experience and for bringing some peace to Cathy Sposito. The story doesn't entirely end there, however. Investigators suspect that Bennett, given the frequency and consistency of his attacks, could have more victims out there. What we know of serious, violent predators like this is that it is very unlikely, given the frequency in which he was willing to act, that these are the only 4 cases that exist, Rhodes explained. They're appealing to the public to come forward with any information. The man investigators say kidnapped and killed 12-year-old Jennifer Odom as she walked home after stepping off a Pasco County school bus in 1993 may be sentenced to death for the crime. State Attorney Bill Glass made that announcement during a press conference in July of this year, after the Hernando County Sheriff's Office announced it has charged Jeffrey Norman Crum with the kidnapping, murder, and sexual assault of Odom 30 years later. Odom was last seen getting off of a school bus on February 19, 1993, to begin the 200-yard walk to her home in northeastern Pasco County, but she never made it. At the time, a massive manhunt was launched, and every law enforcement agency in the Bay Area was looking for a blue truck that was seen in the area by some of her classmates. Every one of us, including those in law enforcement, can look at Jennifer as our niece, our sister, our granddaughter, and realize that it is a tragedy beyond tragedy, stated Hernando County Sheriff Al Nienhui. The blue truck was the focus of the investigation for the last 30 years, as investigators believed that the driver may have been involved in the abduction. 6 days later, on February 25, Odom's body was found along a horse-riding trails off Powell Road in Hernando County. She had been brutally attacked and murdered. We're not exactly sure how long her abductor kept her captive, or when exactly the murder took place. But we are relatively confident the murder took place in that field sometime. Obviously, prior to her being found, the sheriff stated. 2 years later, on January 5, 1995, a couple hunting for scrap metal in a rural area of Hernando County discovered Jennifer's missing book bag and clarinet case, which had fingerprints on it. Every viable lead for the next 30 years, including those that came from the Pasco County Sheriff Office, or the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, or private citizens, was investigated thoroughly, according to Sheriff Nienhuis. 13 months before Odom was abducted, a teenager was kidnapped as she got off a school bus in north central Pasco County. She was brutally attacked and sexually assaulted. Sheriff Nienhuis says she suffered injuries to her head and skull that were very significant, and she was left for dead. She survived, but her life was forever changed. He says she was a true victim. She was not engaged in a high-risk lifestyle and was victimized. Law enforcement was able to get biological material at the time. Since there were similarities between the two girls, detectives believed they may be related. The investigation never stopped, Sheriff Nienhui said. Hundreds of items were tested and retested every time new technology came out in the hopes of finding a smoking gun to solve Odom's murder. Approximately 10 years ago, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reached out to HCSO and offered to scan every piece of paper in Odom's case so it would be readily available. It was more than 75,000 pieces of paper. The biological evidence in Pasco County was tested before February 2015, and detectives got a full DNA profile. However, you need to have someone to match it to in the National DNA Database. Sheriff Nienhui says until 2015, there were no leads on that particular piece of DNA. They compared the DNA to local DNA to see if there were any close matches, which would be a family member. The sheriff says they found the DNA matched the son of the person who turned out to be the suspect. In February 2015, Detective George Lundgren was contacted by a detective from the Pasco County Sheriff's Office, who let him know that they had a solid lead in the original case in which the teen was found alive. They were able to narrow it down to Jeffrey Norman Crum, who quickly became the #1 suspect in the Odom case. I have confidence that we have the right person, and we have the right aggravators in this particular case to treat it as a death penalty case, stated Glass. This is every parent's nightmare. This is the thing that keeps parents up at night worried about their children. Crum was already serving 2 life sentences for the sexual battery and kidnapping case out of Pasco County that was prosecuted around 2015. Hernando County has now charged him with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual battery. Over the last 30 years, countless, literally countless detectives and sworn law enforcement personnel and civilian and tipsters have had a hand in this investigation. Every piece of the mosaic. The minute Crum was identified as a suspect in the Jennifer Odom case, Detective Lundgren went to work putting a mosaic together, or a puzzle. And I can tell you, other than the conviction in the previous case, there was no other piece of the puzzle. That was a big piece of the puzzle. Every other piece of the puzzle that got us to this point were tiny little fragments that gave the state attorney and the grand jury enough confidence to indict Crum, the sheriff said. During the press conference, Sheriff Nianhua showed an old photo of Crum, and he kept reiterating he was not on the investigators' radar until the past few years. The sheriff says, Crum had been arrested in the early 1980s for armed robbery in Hillsborough County. In 1985, he was charged with kidnapping, sexual assault, and false imprisonment in Hillsborough County. He was arrested by Tampa police in 1987 for carrying a concealed weapon. In 1988, he was caught again carrying a concealed weapon and was charged with aggravated assault. In 1998, he was arrested for domestic battery in Hernando County 3 times. In 2001, he was arrested for violation of probation in Hillsborough County. He was arrested a few years later for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon in Hernando County. In 2015, he was arrested in Pasco County for aggravated sexual assault on a child under the age of 12 in Pasco County. He's a bad individual, Sheriff Nianhui stated. Communities in Pasco and Hernando counties were on edge after Jennifer Odom's kidnapping and murder back then. Jeannie Cameron, the general manager at Papa Joe's Italian restaurant in Brooksville, said she and others in the community remember hearing about her disappearance all too well. So we all remember hearing about Jennifer's disappearance and about the blue truck, and everybody was on alert about looking, Cameron said. Back then, 30 years ago, as a parent, I was very angry that someone could do something like that to a child and then leave her there in the middle of nowhere, said Joseph Giarratana, the owner of Papa Joe's Italian restaurant. Jessica Ellis said she went to Waitman Middle School with Odom and played in the same clarinet section in band class. I would say we saw each other a lot. We weren't like close friends, but we knew a lot of the same people. We rode the school bus every day, and I just remember her always being nice, said Ellis, a former classmate. Grief and fear followed in the days, months, and years after Odom's death. It's closure for many in the community who now carry a different perspective. Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office is searching for additional victims. The sheriff said that over the years, a couple of anonymous tips came in that led investigators to believe that there are several people out there with more information about Odom's abduction and murder. And he wants them to come forward. Anyone with information on Odom's kidnapping and murder, or anyone who may be a victim of Crum, is asked to call 352-754-6830 and ask for Detective Lundgren if you do have information on Odom's case. A judge in Florida has ordered a 65-year-old California fugitive held without bond in connection with the murder of a woman 39 years ago. Donald Santini was arrested by U.S. Marshals in California in June and was extradited without protest to the Sunshine State. Authorities said that the suspect has used 13 aliases over the years. Santini was the last person seen with 33-year-old Cynthia Cindy Ruth Wood. The arrest warrant said a medical examiner determined she had been strangled, and Santini's fingerprints were found on her body. You being on the run for almost 40 years is a consciousness of guilt. You knew you were running from something. You are the definition of flight risk, Judge Catherine Catlin told Santini during a hearing in Tampa on Thursday, July 6th. Back in 1984, Santini was known as Charles Michael Stevens, which was an alias he used to flee a warrant in Texas. At the time of his arrest, he was living under the name Wellman Simmons in Campo, California, which is in southeastern San Diego County. Wood met with Santini, who had called her with promises of providing information about her husband, Barry Wood, that could possibly help her win custody of their 2 children, who were 3 and 5, according to previous reports by the Bradenton Herald. Wood also had a son from a previous relationship. Police believe that she was strangled with her body being found in a watery grave 3 days after she was last seen with Santini. Shortly afterwards, he left town. Santini's attorney asked the judge for bail, but prosecutors noted that Santini killed Wood after fleeing a charge in Texas, related to a convenience store robbery in which he was accused of stealing $270 while armed with a knife. You have from his very own mouth that he has been on the lam for 39 years, and he purposely has been using fake IDs so that he can avoid law enforcement, Prosecutor Michelle Doherty told the court. The state's attorney's office also said in court that in interviews, Santini referred Wood's death as a contract killing. "You are the definition of flight risk," the judge told Santini during the hearing. "There is nothing I can do to preserve the safety of this community if I was to let you go." Meanwhile, Santini's public defender, Jamie Kane, said that there's no evidence that the suspect left Texas with an outstanding warrant. Where is the failure to appear warrant? Where is the circuit court case number? Where is the evidence that he was on pretrial release? Other than a simple statement of Mr. Santini, who is not a legal expert, Kane said. Santini was identified by the FBI after he applied for a passport under the name Wellman Simmons. On Thursday, Wood's stepdaughter, Denise Kozer, told the news that she was delighted Santini will be held until trial. "He doesn't deserve any freedom. We've had no freedom for 40 years, wondering where he was. And it's been awful," she said. While Florida Gulf Coast law professor Dr. Pamela Say told the station that Santini's assertion that Wood's death was a contract killing could be bad for his defense. A killing for hire is, in many circles, worse than a killing for passion or some other reason. Say also was not sure if the murder constitutes a death penalty case. It depends on the circumstances surrounding it. What were the aggravating circumstances that contributed to the crime? What is it that caused this? And if you're talking about a contract hit, that could be an aggravating circumstance. That you don't want that kind of person out on the street ever again. That's quite possible, Say said. On Saturday, March 29, 1975, 16-year-old teen Sharon Prior left her home to meet up with her friends at the nearby pizzeria. Unfortunately, she never returned home. Sharon was missing for days, and the community had set up search parties to help the police look for the missing teen. Her body was discovered in a field days after her disappearance. Sharon Prior had been brutally murdered. She had been raped, then asphyxiated. Her body had been covered with bruises. Her life had been cut way too short. Decades after her murder, police are still trying to solve the young teen's murder and bring her killer to justice. Sharon Prior was considered a very reliable and friendly teen. At 16 years old, she was 5'3" and weighed 105 pounds. She had blonde hair and blue eyes. Sharon was heavily involved in the Boys and Girls Club in her town, where she got to play floor hockey and other sports. She was interested in becoming a veterinarian and attended science and biology courses at the high school. She was very bright and creative. She disappeared after setting out to meet friends at a pizza parlor near her home in Montreal's Pointe St. Charles neighborhood. Her body was found 3 days later in a wooded area in Longwool, on Montreal's South Shore. Sharon died a violent death. She was raped, beaten, and died of asphyxiation. The asphyxiation was caused by blood in her lungs. Police said that she probably hemorrhaged internally when her assailant crushed her chest with his knee. This is not easy to do, so they were not only looking for a heavy person, but a strong person as well. The autopsy showed that Sharon was beaten around her head. She had several bruises on her face and 2 fractures on her jaw, on both sides of her mouth. Her nose was broken and there was a hole in one cheek, probably caused by a tooth that was loosened during the struggle. Most cruel is that Sharon was still alive when her body was dumped. When she was found, she was clutching a branch. The cold case, which had puzzled detectives for 48 years, was solved thanks to new DNA testing techniques and the persistence of Prior's family, who fought to keep her death from being forgotten. The solving of Sharon's case will never bring Sharon back, Sharon Prior, one of Sharon's younger sisters, said at a news conference. But knowing that her killer is no longer on this earth and cannot kill anymore brings us to somewhat of a closure. Law enforcement investigated more than 100 suspects over the years, but never made any arrests. Yvonne Prior, the teenager's mother, is now in her 80s, still lives in Canada, and has spent her life searching for her daughter's killer. Romain's name didn't come up in investigation until last year. When Longueuil police started looking through criminal records, they found an extensive history of violence and attempts by Romain to evade law enforcement by moving between West Virginia and Canada. Romain first attempted escape from the West Virginia Penitentiary in 1964 and later escaped in 1967. 2 years later, Romain already had a Canadian rap sheet. Romain was living in Montreal at the time. He had a long criminal record, including at least one rape conviction, but was not initially a suspect in her death. He died in 1982 at the age of 36. He matched the description of a suspect, and his car matched tire tracks found at the scene where Sharon's body was recovered. Ultimately, it was DNA evidence found on a man's shirt used to restrain Sharon that confirmed him as the killer. In 1975, the amount of DNA gathered at the scene was insufficient to be tested or used in court, but it was kept over the years in the hope that it could someday be used to find a match for a suspect as technology improved. The samples were sent to a laboratory in West Virginia in 2019 and later matched to Romain's relatives using data from genealogical websites. Once police matched the DNA from the crime scene to the Romain family from West Virginia, investigators met with Romain's brothers to gather their DNA. They determined that theirs was a near match to the genetic material recovered from the crime scene. Next, police exhumed Romain's body in May of this year and tested his DNA against the DNA left at the crime scene. Sarah Bourgoin, the director of the biology and DNA department at Quebec's National Forensic Laboratory, said retrieving a full genetic profile from Romain's bones was a difficult task. "Happily, here it worked," she said. "We were able to establish a genetic profile by comparing it to the unknown profile in Sharon Prior's case. We remarked that it was identical, which confirmed that it was indeed Franklin Romain who left his DNA at the scene." Longueuil police, the agency that investigated Sharon's death, said the family's dogged pursuit of justice was a key factor that led to them finding the killer. Prior's two younger sisters, Doreen and Maureen, grew emotional as they described Sharon at a news conference. Sharon was a kind, warm-hearted young girl who dreamed of being a veterinarian, the sisters said. "She was a beautiful young lady with a heart of gold," Doreen said. "When she went missing on Easter weekend, the family was distraught. Decades later, they are still scarred by the violence and tragedy of her death," the sisters said. But they thanked the people of Pointe St. Charles for their support over the years as they struggled with her death and all the unanswered questions about the killer's identity. A 36-year-old West Springfield woman who was found dead in her home over the weekend had been stabbed repeatedly, and her death has been ruled a homicide, Fairfax County Police said. The body of Robin Ward Lawrence was found about 12:30 p.m. Sunday by an acquaintance who went to the Contemporary House on Resica Lane to check on her. Lawrence's 2-year-old daughter, Nicole, also was inside and apparently unharmed. Police said that they did not know how long Nicole was left alone, and that an autopsy will be performed to estimate the time of her mother's death. But police spokesman Warren Carmichael said, "We're talking more than a short period of time." The child, who had undergone a liver transplant operation in 1993 at Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh, was taken to Fairfax Hospital for observation and released to her father. Ollie Lawrence, a hospital spokeswoman, said, "Police at the time have not determined a motive in the stabbing, which has shaken a neighborhood that cannot even recall ever having a burglary. At this time, There are a lot of unknowns in this case, Carmichael said. There are a lot of questions, and we don't have answers. Carmichael said there was no evidence of sexual assault. He would not say how police believe the assailant entered the home, which is on a quiet cul-de-sac in a community called The Crossing, about 2 blocks from West Springfield High School. A neighbor said 2 women brought Nicole to the neighbor's home on Sunday and asked to use the phone to call police. The women said Lawrence's husband, an executive with U.S. Air, was away on business and had been unable to contact his wife by phone. The husband had called the women and asked them to check on her. Ollie Lawrence, vice president of human resources for the airline, was on a business trip in Nassau, Bahamas, a spokesman said. Employed with the company since 1978, he received a Management Achievement Award in 1990. Robin War Lawrence worked at an office of the Merchants Tire and Auto Centers in Manassas. At the nearby Manassas Merchants store, where Lawrence often took her dark gray Nissan 300ZX to be serviced, employees were stunned to hear about the homicide. "She was just a real sweetheart," said Kevin Berry, the assistant manager at the store. "Everybody in here saw her because she always brought her car in. I don't know why anyone would want to kill her. It's just terrible." DNA was found at the scene, but at the time, there was no match. In 2019, cold case detectives began working with Parabon Nanolabs, a company in Northern Virginia that specializes in DNA phenotyping and genetic genealogy analysis. The company worked to build a family tree to narrow down who the suspect could be. The company uses processes that predict physical appearance and biological relationships from unidentified DNA evidence. Pictures of Stephen Smirk, 51, of Niskayuna, New York, from 1988 and 1998, were found and compared to a digital composite image created by Parabon Nanolabs. Fairfax County detectives traveled to New York, where they obtained a murder confession from Smirk. Police Chief Kevin Davis said, "Smirk was arrested on second-degree murder charges and is awaiting extradition to Virginia." Smirk was a member of the Army in 1994 and was stationed at Fort Myer, now known as Joint Base Myer-Henderson Hall. He has no criminal history, and Davis said, "Smirk is not currently suspected in any other crimes." The murder of Lawrence appears to have been a random act, and no motive was given. If you enjoyed the video, please show your support by subscribing and liking the video. And turn on all notifications so you don't miss any future uploads.